All right, we're gonna get started with the session. First, welcome everyone. Thank you for attending this session on core competencies, practical application. Today we have Dominic Olshenek, tech team member from BC. And we also have John Smith, the regional coordinator for Alberta and also a tech team member. So Dom and John will be mostly presenting the session. As I mentioned previously, if anyone has any question or needs some translation, I'm here and Dom is here as well. We'll be pleased to do it. If anyone has questions, please write them in the chat. We'll reserve some time at the end of the session to answer your questions. Right.
All right, well, yeah, just as Jen gets things queued up, thank you everyone for coming out and attending tonight. It's going to be a little bit of overview information on the core competencies, and then perhaps maybe looking at them from a slightly different perspective, trying to just kind of understand how the core competencies work, right from the quick ride progression all the way up through some of the intermediate material and just some different scenarios there. I know we have some experienced instructors on the call with us, so for many of you, some of this may be a bit of a review, but if it sparks any questions or comments that you'd like, as Jen said, please feel free to use the chat bar and let us know there so we can address them at the end. Jen, if you're ready to go with the slideshow, if you wouldn't mind.
Do you see the slideshow right now?
I do not.
Sorry, guys, it's just me getting. Just give me a few seconds. You see it?
There we are.
Thanks.
Looking good.
Perfect. So yeah, core competencies, a practical application. And that's something that's really important here because a lot of times we kind of just throw the terms and the phrases around without attaching some real meaning to them. Getting into the presentation, why are the competencies useful? First and foremost, they can provide us with a bit of an analysis tool as instructors. And then for us communicating with our students, they're also just a simple way of communicating technical information or kind of outcomes that we'd like our students to be aware of. The core competencies form the foundation of good snowboarding technique. Advanced and expert riders continue to develop and adapt the core competencies as the riding progresses. And that's really important to note as well for a lot of you in your own development. Just because you've kind of covered the core competencies once doesn't mean that's stopped in our riding and development. It's something that we continue to refine and develop in more and more challenging situations. Initially, the core competencies were referred to as just the basic competencies, but we felt that didn't really do them justice. So we changed the name to the core competencies. It's applicable to all riders from beginner all the way up to expert. So of course, what are the core competencies? Should be a brief review for many of you that are teaching or have taught courses. The three core competencies are centered and mobile, turning with the lower body, and balance along the working edge. Previously, we talked about just being balanced over the working edge. However, that's kind of just one-dimensional, and we just tweaked the wording a little bit. Along the edge also includes for the length of the snowboard between the nose and the tail. It just gives a little bit more of a holistic picture just when the phrasing of the words themselves. So Now that we kind of know what they are at a glance, we'll go in and look a little bit more closely at some of the definitions behind these competencies. Dom, if you wouldn't mind.
Sweet. So the first one, and maybe one of the most kind of core ones, most basic one, is centered and mobile. It really just comes down to being relaxed and maneuverable, adaptable on top of the snowboard, and balanced. If you're not standing, you're not snowboarding, right? So one of the things we've kind of updated recently is the neutral position, which speaks to the rotational alignment between the shoulders, hips, and knees. We want those all stacked over top of each other and then aligned with each other with just a slight anticipation of where we're going. The rider also is going to maintain equal weight over their feet, which means that they're not going to be leaning back, which is one of the common problems that we'll see later on, or leaning too far forward, just keeping the weight centered over the feet. All our joints are flexed evenly. So again, kind of reflecting that we're not over the nose or the tail too much, but also meaning that we're not bending too much in one joint versus another. So we're not breaking at the waist. We're kind of getting a nice bend in our ankles, knees, and hips rather than all of it in one spot. And then just generally trying to keep that kind of loose, athletic, ready to act kind of position that promotes doing a sport, right? Like snowboarding is a sport and we need to be not stiff, but not noodly. There's that kind of fine in between that is going to define sort of an active, ready position. I'll hand it off to John for the next one.
Alrighty, so next up, turning with the lower body. Now, when we're turning with the lower body, we kind of referring mostly to the hips and knees with our beginner and novice students. And as the ability level rises up, we start turning with the feet a little bit more. A lot of times we'll primarily think about the rotational movements involved in turning with the lower body. However, it's important to remember that there is also a lateral component. So putting the board on an edge, allowing that grip to kind of become established, gives us something to rotate against and actually create a little bit of steering in the snowboard. So this one's really important, just making sure that we are getting efficient use of the snowboard and having efficient movements. We've all seen those students who are, counter rotating down the hill, just kind of kicking their back foot out, and they're really struggling to kind of change direction because they're never really in a very centered position, so they can't get the grip over the edge. So jumping ahead here, but they all really do tie together, the competencies, the skills. But the big thing is turning with the lower body is rotational movement, as well as a little bit of lateral movement onto the edge. And the combination of those two things allow us to make nice round turns and hopefully symmetrical turns on the heel side and toe side, just for control. On to the next one, please.
And then finally, balance along the working edge. I like the word that John just used for turning with the lower body. He said efficient. And then the other kind of flip side to the coin is effective. And that's really what we're looking at here. We want not just to be centered over top of the edge, but we want that edge to be doing something. We want it to be effective. We want edge grip rather than just kind of hanging out, letting the board do whatever it wants. So we do that by moving our mass over the edge, either leaning or bending, getting it closer to the edge to manipulate the angle that the board's on. And that's what's going to give us effective edge grip, which influences that turn shape John talked about and helps us make rounder turns, helps us hold a straight line, helps us cut across the hill. It helps us do a lot of things effectively. Ideally, we're going to be doing this by balancing the amount of bending and leaning that we're doing. There's always going to be some small amount of leaning that's necessary. And then we want to add in as much bending as we need to deal with the pressures that we're feeling. Sometimes you can add in more leaning, more inclination as you see fit to handle more speed or to have a bit more fun, that sort of thing. Part of it is also balancing the pressure along the whole length of the edge, so making sure that we have grip at the nose as well as at the tail, or possibly moving that grip along the edge by moving our body over top of the board and dealing with the pressure as it comes through the turn. The physics of the turn kind of change drastically as we go through the whole shape of it. So we got to be moving and dealing with that as we go. And the clear signs of this is you can kind of set in your mind what kind of track you want to do. Do you want to make a sliding turn, a skidded turn, a carved turn? And then you can kind of check back and have a look. And did you actually achieve that? Or did your students actually achieve that? Yeah, thanks, Nick.
All righty. So now that we know what those core competencies are, how can they be used? At first, for an instructor, it's really an assessment tool or just a kind of a checklist when you're analyzing new students. Say you have a group of students you've identified, had good conversations with them and the base area before heading up for your assessment run. They can turn a little bit. So when you're watching them come down, you kind of look at those competencies kind of one at a time, just to give you maybe a slight indication of what you might need to work on in the lesson. Okay, does it look like they're evenly balanced between both feet? Yes. Are they moving a little bit? Okay, are they turning with the lower body, or are they counter rotating? Yep, that seems okay. Not too bad. And then maybe, balance along the working edge. Okay, heel sides looking pretty good. Ooh, something weird with the toe side. Then you have maybe some kind of indication of something you might want to work on there. In this instance, probably related to edging. The other thing as well is they just allow us to communicate technical concept with simple phrases and keywords. So rather than some of us, many of you with experience teaching snowboarding have a large wealth of knowledge inside your brain. If you try and pass a portion of that to your students, they're just going to be overloaded. Whereas these phrases just kind of help us indicate some light riding goals and things that they might want to keep in mind, something that they should understand to help themselves ride a little better. And then the third point there is the competencies can help us to develop a riding goal for novice students. Now, the reason help is underlined there is because people don't show up to learn core competencies or skills in a snowboard lesson. They want to learn to control their speed on steeper runs. They want to be able to get through the flat spots a little bit easier, or try some basic freestyle stuff. So it's really important that they just the competencies can give us a little bit of a direction as far as what we are going to learn, but we need to work with the students to help them to help figure out why they need to be learning those things, and how what you need to show them can align with what their personal riding goals are. So the other thing to keep in mind is we have the skills and the competencies working together. So the skills concept has been around since the beginning of CASI. Whereas the competencies are something we just kind of developed, or we adopted in the last 8 years, 10 years, something like that. And we've kept them in place, and they're working alongside one another, and they're interconnected. Because we have the 5 skills: position and balance, pivot, edging, pressure, and timing coordination. And those break down even further into their components if you want to get technical, but we'll save that for another session. And it's through applying all of the skills and a smooth execution of those skills, that's what allows us to achieve the competencies in our riding. The skills concept really provides us with a technical framework to break things down into even smaller chunks. Skills are a great way of breaking down snowboard technique into different actions that produce specific results. Whereas I think you can probably see just from some of the wording and the competencies, they might line up a little bit more with one skill or another, but they definitely all blend together a little bit more than the skills do. So yeah, the skills allow us to get down to the nitty gritty and really get things under the microscope, whereas the competencies allow us to assess the outcome overall and kind of a bigger picture kind of assessment before we get into the finer details. So we'll move things along and we'll just try and think quickly about how the core competencies apply in Quick Ride.
Yeah, thanks, John. That was a really good explanation of what the competencies are all about. So in the Quick Ride, the competencies can be as simple as plug and play. For you as the instructor, you can literally just turn to them and go, I'm going to try and get my student more centered and mobile while we learn to do X, Y, or Z thing, right? So you can literally just plug those competencies in. The core competencies are written in a really nice way that you don't have to translate them at all. You can just talk about them as is. You don't have to change that at all. There's no technical jargon there, right? And so the Quick Ride is kind of designed or was designed prior to the core competencies in a way that was already kind of achieving these outcomes that John just talked about, right? So now we can kind of break up different components of the basics all the way up to turning and stuff and identify where we're working on which competency, which can help you as, say, a level 1 instructor kind of develop your teaching skills a little bit beyond just regurgitating what you heard on the course. Rather than just going through the Quick Ride steps, you can kind of think a little bit deeper about why are you doing each specific task and how is it affecting their snowboarding, and then how does that kind of evolve as they go through the Quick Ride. And as you get to level 2 and you start thinking about using kind of the whole part whole way of teaching that helps influence your analysis, which then gives you a chance to think about, well, am I ready to move on to the next thing? Have they gotten centered and mobile enough while doing push, push, glide that they're ready to move on to the next step? Are they ready to move on to sliding? Are they centered and mobile while push, push, glide? If the answer is no, then they're not ready, right? If the answer is yes, but only sometimes, maybe that gives you a chance to kind of dig into a skill and go a little deeper. And if the answer is yes all the time, then for sure you're ready to move on, right? So the goal is to get all the way up to doing beginner turns and linking those beginner turns and getting out on green runs in the Quick Ride. So we're trying to blend all the skills by the end. We want to tick all the boxes and have that yes all the time answer for all 3 competencies as we kind of get to linking our turns by the end of it.
I just wanted to add in there as well, Dom.
Yeah, for sure.
A lot of times people may have been through all of the progression steps, but maybe just going back a little bit and focusing on 1 or 2 of those steps and trying to improve the quality of movements there will help them achieve more success later on. Like the one Dom just mentioned was like maybe being centered and mobile. Maybe when they're straight running, they are centered between their feet, but you can tell they're still just nervous and tall. If we go back through that step and, you know, they're nervous and tall all the way through their snowboard progression when you're asking them to turn, if we want to loosen them up and get them a little more mobile, getting them to just do some straight running with vertical flexion extension sometimes is just enough to help them feel comfortable. And then you add that in a traverse and then just get them to take it away in turns. And that's just kind of building the skills. So sometimes just looking for the one that needs fixing and just revisiting a step in Quick Ride can go a long way, kind of with the whole part whole method you mentioned, but more applied to the beginner and novice students.
Yeah. So a few examples of this, for example, a few examples of where we're working on each core competencies throughout the Quick Ride. Centered and mobile, we're really focused on at the beginning in the basics and mobility, sliding. That's really almost entirely about building this position, this stance on the snowboard, being able to stand on a snowboard in general, right? Because if we're not standing, we're not snowboarding. That's where we're really working on kind of establishing not just how to stand on the snowboard, but how to move on top of it and kind of make sure that it's doing what you want it to do rather than what it wants to do. And then later, as we get to control phase, we start to experiment a little bit further with mobility, kind of getting over the nose and tail a little bit more and seeing what that does to the board. And then I'll just kind of challenge you guys to think a little further ahead through the quick ride. Where would you think in your own head, where would centered and mobile come up in turning or in linking? And I'll just give you kind of a second to think about that before I move on. We won't, it's not a skill testing question or anything. It's just a little exercise. Right? So then the next one, turning with the lower body, it comes up the most, obviously, when we're learning to turn. That's kind of like the main skill we're learning there is pivot, and that's very closely related to turning with the lower body as an outcome. But we start kind of training that into our students, getting that going, getting that ball rolling as early as sliding with the heel and toe drag and the kind of J turns that we do without the heel and toe drag, where we're trying to make that happen, get the hips moving in that direction, get the knees moving in that direction on purpose. Pendulum with a little bit of ankle movement, fine-tuning how the edge is controlling our direction, as well as power pendulum, which implements really that full-on rotation again. So we're kind of hinting at where we're going, which is the goal of turning, right? Throughout those first few steps. You could even argue, for example, in basics, turning with the lower body comes up. Again, I'm not going to tell you the answer. I'll let you guys think about that one. And then obviously in linking, we're just refining that skill that we learned in turning, right? So when we learn beginner turns, we're kind of rough around the edges. Is it good enough? And then as we get to linking, we're trying to kind of pull those moves together, make them more efficient, like John said, and really refine that turning with the lower body that we have. And then when we get to balance along the working edge, that's another one that kind of appears throughout, but maybe a little bit more later. Again, we have to be standing first. That's why we do centered and mobile first. Balance along the working edge really comes into play when you're on the control phase. That's the main one where we're learning to stand on the edge and slide down the hill. That's kind of the main difficulty students run into there. And that's why we have so many small steps in control, right? You're going to do the gas pedal exercise. Then you might do a 1 foot slide down the hill, or if they're kids, you might get them crab walking. Then you might kind of slowly ease that foot onto the board. You're not even doing a side slip yet. They still have 1 foot strapped in, but it's not on the snow, it's on the snowboard now. And then eventually you're going to get the board on, and you're going to do a side slip assisted, right? And then you're going to do it on their own. You're going to get reps in, you're going to get lots of mileage in. So there's so many small steps built in there, and there's a bunch of small steps built into all the parts of the quick ride. And our goal is to just make that learning process, develop that outcome, being balanced on the working edge, which is really difficult at that level, throughout a whole series of small steps, right? But then it comes in again later. So I'll challenge you guys to think again, how does balance along the working edge come into play during turning and linking? John, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was just going to mention along those points, when you guys are teaching beginners, make sure that it's not just about getting through the step of quick ride, but also making sure that they're kind of doing it a little more correctly and just kind of hitting some of those points. And even if they do something well, there's still always small ways to improve. Like, hey, just remember to flex a little more at the hip, knee, and ankle, just to get a little bit lower, and that'll make you a little more stable going through. And just kind of, just the quality you put into the feedback goes a long way to helping our students kind of develop those habits throughout their snowboarding. So if we can catch them early.
And remember, in order to know what to say, you can think of these core competencies. That's another role they play How do you come up with that feedback? Well, you ask yourself, are they centered and mobile, right? Are they centered and mobile good enough? Is there any small way they could be more centered and mobile, right? I think we can move on, Jen.
Thanks, Tom. So yeah, getting into novice riders, this is certainly where some of us might be a little more comfortable or familiar with applying the core competencies. And essentially, we're using it, just as we mentioned earlier, as kind of a filter to aid our analysis. Just kind of, I'm not sure what to look for. Well, start with the competency and then work your way through from there. Is perhaps there maybe like a symptom we notice in their riding that possibly needs addressing? So we kind of assess them, then we try to break it down into a little bit smaller, the more technical analysis, which will get us towards our competency and skill. Then we try and determine a goal to help them improve. And then we pick a plan for improvement. For example, if we're watching a novice rider come down the hill and they're getting some edge chatter in the turns, it could be a number of different things. But in this instance, we can tell the student looks like they have really straight legs. So you could probably guess which core competency we would choose to focus on in this situation. And this will kind of be centered and mobile. So we really know that we need to kind of improve that vertical mobility. So our overall goal is to develop mobility to improve speed control and turn shape. Notice it's not just kind of that portion of the core competency, but it's to improve speed control and turn shape. And that's the practical side of the goal for our students to be aware of. And then quite simply, the plan, there's any number of things you could do to help improve this student. But for this example, working on flexion and extension in the traverse, and then also some straight run with vertical movement. So by kind of going through, get a little bit of practice on that, get them through the exercise, give them some feedback on the exercise, practice the feedback, and maybe a couple times through the training cycle. And then they should be ready to put that back into their riding and hopefully take the chatter out of those turns. So moving on to the next slide, please. So another example, students coming down the hill, it looks like they kind of lack some speed control. Maybe one turn is where they're kind of hitting the brakes, and then the other turn, they're just kind of skidding across the snow quite quickly. I'm not sure what's going on there, but we noticed they seem to be counter rotating a fair bit to turn the snowboard. So it's got you thinking they probably need to work on turning with the lower body. What we need to do is kind of improve that connection between the upper and the lower body. So the goal for these students in this case would be to develop more efficient turning movements to better control speed and line, their direction of travel. And the plan we have for this student is just looking across the run between the turns, or this is just an exercise Dom has named just the book exercise. Pretend you're reading a book over the nose of your snowboard as you're going across the hill, just to kind of square the students up and get them moving in the right direction. Other exercise that would work great for this is the hand switching exercise. If you guys haven't seen that one, you'll have to join us on a member session, or kind of statue turns. So just making sure that if we are turning the upper body, the lower body is working with it, and they should be kind of rotating in the same direction all at once. If any of you have had the pleasure of teaching novice snowboarders, you know this is quite commonly one of the issues that needs resolving. And it's usually also associated with some of the other competencies as well. So sometimes it's not necessarily right or wrong, because you can address either issue and you're still probably going to improve the other one as well. So anyway, the final example would be, say they can't really traverse and hold an edge effectively. it looks like maybe saying they're flexed pretty evenly and they've got like good inclination and angulation to create that edge platform, but it's just not really turning for them. Chances are they don't have their weight evenly distributed between those to have them balanced along the edge. So what we need to work on is balance along the working edge, improving grip, especially in the nose of the snowboard in this case. So the goal here would be to develop a more dynamic use of edge grip for better control and more reliable edge hold. So just getting them, as they say, they finish the turn, they're a little bit nervous and they know they need to be sunk down to get some edge grip at the end of the turn, but it's just their back foot that's kind of gripping. The front foot is just sliding away on them. So in this instance, one of the things we could do to help them just be a little more aware of that body position and how it affects their edging is maybe just trying to ride fore and aft, practice riding a little bit more on your back foot. That's kind of what they've been doing. Then we'll get them to practice riding a little bit more on the front foot, kind of overcompensating. A couple other things would just be have them maybe thinking about pedaling during some beginner turns, or even just some sliding 360s to kind of build some awareness. So I really like this example because it does kind of show you once again that the competencies do all kind of revolve around one another. It's just a matter of kind of isolating one and choosing something to work on, and you will get improvements for sure. There's more than anytime you've got a student in a lesson, there's probably one or two main things that you might want to address. But there's any number of ways to solve those problems as well, because they are all interconnected.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's one of the big kind of things going from more of a level 1 instructor to a level 2 and then on to a level 3 instructor is knowing as many different ways of solving a problem as you can, because some people will respond to that first solution and other people won't. So then you're going to have to go to a second one, and then maybe that one works, or maybe it doesn't. And then you go to a third one, and then that's the one that jived for that person and really unlocked something and made that improvement, made that lesson worthwhile for them. So having a vast knowledge of experience really helps when you're kind of assessing your students and then trying to come up with solutions for them. And speaking further to that, this next one that we're going to kind of talk about when we get to intermediate riders, a lot of the time intermediate riders come to a lesson and they will have something kind of specific in mind. When you get beginners, they say, I want to learn to snowboard. They don't really know what snowboarding is. So that's the goal for them, is I want to learn to snowboard. Novice riders, they're going to have some pretty kind of glaring things, but they still don't really know. They say, I want to get better at snowboarding. They don't really know what is even possible necessarily with snowboarding as a novice. So then they come to you, you do an assessment lap, and then kind of make a plan from there, usually. With intermediate riders, they've kind of tasted the different aspects of snowboarding, and they're going to come to you with more specific kind of questions or goals in mind. And so that's where we can kind of start to use a little bit more of a planning process earlier in the lesson. Ultimately, our goal is to get the intermediate riders being able to apply the skills sooner in the turn than they were before. If we can do stuff earlier in the turn, it's going to make us more efficient and more effective. Choosing a competency is going to help align that lesson goal with like their goal with what we're thinking in our head. So the student's goal with the technical goal. The competency can be a good bridge between the two and help tie everything together, especially if you have groups. You can start to kind of pick out the 5 different goals that you've heard in your group and then be like, what's the common thread here? What ties all this together? You go, okay, yes, they all could benefit from turning with the lower body better. We're going to work on that. And this is where the TTPEE model comes in. And if we go to the next slide, we'll take a look at some of these and then go through a few examples of goals that kind of tie into each of these different factors So the TTPEE model is technical, tactical, physical, psychological, equipment, and environment. So these are all the different factors that kind of affect our snowboarding. So we've just kind of created some goals that align to one to each factor. It doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't align to another factor, but we're just trying to give you a little bit of a taste of how you can apply this model with the core competencies to start making a lesson plan before you've even seen them snowboard. You can do this at the base when you're talking to your guests. You haven't even gone up a lift yet, and you're already starting to get the ball rolling, which is going to help you with that first run selection. And if you get that first run selection right, that's going to help you with your lesson plan, and that's going to help you with your time management, and you're going to deliver better lessons this way. So if you have, for example, a student or students at the bottom who are saying, I want to make a carve turn today, my mind immediately goes to balance along the working edge, because you need to control the pressure throughout the turn and along the snowboard in order to make that carve turn. It's kind of a high bar for are you balanced on the snowboard, right? And as I'm thinking about those factors, I'm starting to realize, okay, the couple of the skills that are jumping out to me are pressure and edging. I just said those words while I was thinking about why balance along the working edge is important to learning a carve turn. So those two words jump out. And now as I'm sitting on the chairlift, I'm thinking about some pressure drills, some edging drills. And I'm starting to plan out that first run. And this is before I've even seen the students. I don't know what they look like. I don't know what their issues are, but I'm starting to give myself a couple of branches that I could go down, a couple of options. Then when I see the students, I'm going to pick one and I'm going to go with that way. So the next example for a tactical factor is I want to ride POW. It's not so technical. It's kind of a broad goal, but I know that you need a strong position. You need to be adaptable. So you need to be centered and mobile. And I know that position and balance is closely tied in with that. And I also know that pressure is a big factor in the POW because it's not always a perfectly smooth surface underneath. Sometimes there's moguls underneath. Sometimes you're kind of going over rollers and sinking into the POW and then rising back up. So there's a lot of pressure going on when you're riding POW. So those are a couple of the skills that come to mind when I think about being centered and mobile in the POW. So you can see how this kind of goes down a chain and then you can justify it by going back up the chain, right? There's a logic to this plan. Physical factors, the student tires out easily, has low stamina. Maybe you know this because they've told you this, or maybe you know this from days previous when they were beginners. When you taught them the 2 days previous, they were running out of energy a lot. So you're thinking, okay, now that they're kind of more of an intermediate, we're going to work on turning with the lower body, and we're going to just try and get as efficient as possible so that they can last all day, especially when they get on the mountain and they're doing longer runs. That stamina is going to come in. It's going to be a big factor. So I know to be efficient, there's a lot of good exercises when I'm working on pivot. And I know that timing and coordination is kind of the key thing that makes someone really efficient versus not so efficient, right? If you get the timing right, things really fall into place and are a lot easier. Psychological factors, students are afraid of steeps. They're not comfortable on steeps. They have this feeling that they might go out of control. We're going to work on balance along the working edge there, because if they have a strong braking skill, they're able to stop themselves at a moment's notice. They can do a hockey stop, as skiers would say. They'll feel a little bit safer about going into a steep situation and picking up speed because they feel like they have a safety net, right? So I'm justifying a very mental kind of challenge with technical snowboarding. And then, okay, how do I develop those braking skills? Well, I'm going to do that by working on edging, most likely, right? Digging that board in, finding better ways to dig the board in and dig it in more effectively. Or maybe position and balance, just as the first two that come to mind. There's plenty of correct answers here. If they're riding a rocker snowboard, that poses a challenge in itself. We obviously can't always just take them inside and get them a new snowboard. Sometimes that it is what it is, right? And hopefully you have enough experience to know what riding a rocker snowboard is like. And hopefully you have enough experience to know what it's like for an intermediate student to ride a rocker snowboard and the challenges that they face when they're on one of those boards versus on a full camber snowboard. And hopefully then you'll know that being centered and mobile is really key, because you need to be in the middle of that board, but you also need to be moving from nose to tail over that board and kind of controlling where you are over top of it, because it's a little loosey-goosey, right? So we're going to need to work on our mobility along the snowboard, and we're going to need to work on making sure that we get just the right amount of edging, or just the right amount of pivot, or just the right amount of whatever at the right time in the turn. We got to be on our game when we're riding full rocker snowboards. It's funny because they sell them as easier to turn, but they're, in my experience, actually kind of harder at that novice intermediate level anyways, if we want to have good, efficient, and effective turns. And then finally, an environmental factor is that maybe it's a really icy day. And, you know, going into that day, you haven't even met your students yet. You're just walking off the bus, getting to the hill. And you're like, oh, it's going to be a tough day for the intermediates. You already know you're going to be working on turning with the lower body, because we want to smooth out those turns. We want to kind of glide across the ice rather than trying to fight it, right? So we want to make a nice, smooth, skidded turn to maintain speed rather than it constantly being accelerating and decelerating all the time. And you already kind of have a default lesson plan that you're going to in your head. Maybe it involves pivot, or maybe it involves smearing the pressure through the turn, getting the pressure higher in the turn. Maybe these things are coming to mind already. You haven't even met your students. So the core competencies can be really useful in planning a lesson, either after you've seen the student, before you've seen the student, or even just theoretically sitting at home. Come up with situations, whether it's a beginner, a novice, or an intermediate, and kind of challenge yourself to make a bit of a lesson plan. And I like to start with the core competency first, or the advanced competency, if that's the level I'm aiming at, and then kind of work my way towards a more technical, pinpointed solution in those skills. Do you have anything to add, John or Jen?
I just really think this last slide does a great job of giving you a little food for thought on maybe how you can adapt those lessons to suit your students in this scenario. That's really important, and that's usually kind of what makes a difference between a good instructor and a great instructor. So if you're just kind of applying the skills that Dom mentioned here, and just thinking how they might apply in slightly different scenarios, you'll be setting yourself and your students up for success. So that more or less concludes the presentation. We do have some time for questions or comments. If anyone has something, we can stick around. But certainly, thank you very much for coming out. This presentation will be available on our YouTube channel. If anyone would like to refer back to it, or pass it along to your friends and colleagues. Yeah, thank you very much. And we'll hang around for a few minutes if anyone has some questions.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dom and John. Very good presentation. I think it was very refreshing, with a lot of precise and useful information. I'm sure our members share the same. If anyone has any question, you're more than welcome to just raise your hand and speak it out, or just write it in the chat if you prefer. I've been answering a few questions privately already. And if you don't have any question, this session was recorded, and it's going to be posted, as I mentioned previously, on our YouTube channel in the next few days.